First of all, you've heard our names, Brandy and Prim. This is the trauma conference, and I'm going to stop us right there because we do have some goals today, some objectives. Brandy is going to talk about trauma and how it affects the brain and what trauma looks like at schools. And then I will start talking about that as well. And then what systems can we put in place to, hey, I see an error already. Grammar, hello, sorry. What systems can we put in place to help our students in trauma? Okay, old English teacher, I'm mad at myself right now, but I'll get over it. Okay. All right, Brandy, I'm going to let you get started here.
All right, perfect. So and some of this was covered yesterday, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but trauma is a deeply distressing experience that can be emotionally, mentally, or physically overwhelming for a person. But it's important to remember that trauma impacts everyone differently. So what may be traumatic for me as a person, the same event may not be traumatic for you. And if it's traumatic for both of us, it may impact us differently, and we may demonstrate our trauma differently. So a few years ago, I was in a car accident with my husband and my parents. And after that, for about 6 months, I was the world's worst passenger because I was slightly traumatized by the car accident. And you know, when there is a brake pedal on student drivers' cars, yeah, it's a good thing that wasn't in my new car because I would have given everybody whiplash because I was constantly like, you're too close, you're driving too fast. So that accident for about 6 months to a year, you know, I was still feeling that when other people drove. Well, other people in the car, like my husband, immediately afterwards, he like was not traumatic for him at all, even though he was the one driving. It wasn't his fault though, we were rear-ended. I just want to give that caveat there. So, you know, all four of us were in the same car, experienced the same thing. It was a little more traumatic for me than it was other people. So that's always something to keep in mind. Just because children go through something that we may experience as traumatic or not as traumatic, that doesn't mean that that is their same experience. So there's also a few different types of trauma. So there's single event trauma. That's like one big event that people experience. So like the Paradise Fire was a single event trauma, if a flood, and like somebody that has gone through an assault, those are all big single event traumas. There's also complex trauma. So those are ongoing traumatic events. So that could be anything from community violence, child abuse, child neglect, any type of ongoing trauma. Secondary or vicarious trauma is the trauma that people experience by hearing about other people's trauma. So counselors, psychologists, social workers, teachers, you guys supporting kids in school that are going through just really traumatic things in their lives, that impacts you as well. And then there's intergenerational trauma. And that's how a traumatic event can impact generations to come. So when we talk about breaking the cycle, that's part of what that is. Just because I didn't experience a trauma, but my mother did or my grandmother did, it can impact me as well. There's this really interesting study in Epigenetics where they looked at soldiers who in the Civil War who lived through prisoner of war camps, and their children who were born after the soldiers' experience in a prisoner of war camp had higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of illnesses than the children that were born before to those same soldiers before that experience. They also did a really interesting study with rats where rats were shocked at the same time the scent was given over and over again, right? So eventually they started having this traumatic response whenever the scent was given because they expected to get shocked. They then took these rats' babies and grandbabies and had them raised by like foster rat families. And those babies and grandbaby rats also didn't experience a traumatic response to that scent, but experience like a lower level of anxiety response around that scent. So we're still learning about how trauma changes how genes maybe express themselves and some of those type of things. So that's still ongoing research. So it's important to recognize that trauma can go through generations as well. And you don't necessarily have to directly experience a traumatic event to be impacted by that. So it's really interesting to think about how trauma actually changes the structure of the brain. So most of the brain development is done, up until the child is 5 years old. And there's when people talk about trauma in the brain, they talk about like 3 big parts of that brain. So the first part they talk about is the brainstem, and that's the first piece of the brain that develops. And that is like controls your arousal, automatic responses. It's just sort of what controls your survival, all of those type of things. Next is the limbic region, and that's the amygdala and the hippocampus. They're responsible for your experience and expression of emotion and your memory. So that amygdala is really interesting because that's sort of like the smoke detector of your brain. So when something traumatic happens, that's like what goes off to tell you like what that something dangerous is happening, and that can actually register fear before children has language. So those experiences are stored as body fear or emotion. So kids can actually have a traumatic experience. They don't have language associated with it yet, but it's all kind of that physical trauma experience. Kids whose amygdala is impacted by trauma experience or the development of their amygdala are more likely to react to triggers. They have difficulty regulating their emotions. They have emotional extremes. They struggle their reward pathways are different. So those are like the kids that always seem less motivated to do things. They don't get as much pleasure from activities as other kids do. So that all could be due to the development of that piece of their brain. Trauma also makes kids' hippocampus smaller, and that impacts their ability to pay attention, their learning, their memory. So that's all in that limbic region of the brain. The last piece of the brain to develop is that cortex, and that keeps developing all the way up into adolescence or early 20s. And that's the higher level cognition and thinking. And if that is impacted by trauma, kids can actually get fear responses triggered when there's no danger around. So trauma impacts the development of the structures of the brain, but it also impacts how your neurons connect within the brain. So your neurons talk to each other and develop pathways because of your daily experiences. So children who have really experiences that teach them that the world is loving and kind and they can expect what is coming next, those pathways become stronger and stronger. Kids whose lives are chaotic and they don't feel like they get that love and connection, and they feel like they always have to be on alert, then those pathways get stronger and stronger, and the other ones start getting pruned. So just your daily experiences also impact how trauma can impact your brain development and the growth of your brain. So pre-COVID, I found this really interesting data back from 2005. So it's a little bit dated, but in 2005, CPS, or Child Protective Services, reported that there were 899,000 children that suffered from maltreatment and 564 children that suffered from neglect in the United States. And those are just the cases that get to the CPS level. So we all know there's lots of cases that don't have CPS involvement. And we all also know that there's lots of traumatic experiences that kids go through that aren't even appropriate for CPS involvement. But that just gives us some kind of context with the numbers of children across the nation who are experiencing trauma. there isn't a ton of data that I could find on the new research of children impacted by trauma post-COVID. But in April through October 2020, people were trying to stay away from hospitals and emergency rooms due to COVID. So overall emergency room visits decreased by 42%, while mental health related visits to emergency rooms increased by 24% for children aged 5 to 11 and 31% for children aged 12 to 17 years. So we're seeing an increase of mental health needs for our students post-COVID. A survey of parents conducted in June 2020 indicated that 14% of those parents saw worsening mental health for their children. So, you know, students impacted by trauma, there were a lot of them before the pandemic, and there's going to be even more of them now post-pandemic. We've seen some of them come back to our buildings already. We'll see more of them probably coming back in the fall. So with these numbers, we can't respond on an individual student basis. We have to start thinking of a systems level and how we as a system can support students impacted by trauma.
And that's, I mean, that's a lot of information, and that's a lot going on with these kiddos. And I know we're all seeing this in our schools. What I'd like to do now is make it a little more interactive. Gianna, our host, is going to send you to a breakout session. You're going to be with 3 other people. And we would like it if you share what the trauma looks like at your school, what's going on now, what was going on before, is it different, how's it changed? Just kind of little interaction and talk about the trauma that's going on at your schools. Just remember, no names. We want to, this is being recorded, so we don't want to talk about anyone's names, but just talking about the trauma that you see.
So we talked about a lot of the younger kids that they're afraid to leave their families now, because if they do, then something will happen when they're gone. They've been with them for, you know, the whole year. And so it's very traumatic for them to, I have to go to school. And then also too, the students coming into tests that are distance learners, it's funny to see the dynamic of them when they're in the school building, and it's like they forgot how to socialize and interact with one another. So I think that that's going to be huge for next year, and, you know, having them regain those social skills again.
That's a very good point. Very good point. And I think that's the point of summer school coming up, right? To try to help those kiddos that have been distance learning to figure it out. But I have totally seen that with our distance learners coming in. It's just like the deer in the headlight look. They're just not even sure about even being in the building. So for sure. Thank you, Megan, for sharing that. Is there anybody else out there that would like to jump in?
I think one of the things that we talked about in our session is that we don't really even begin to know what the trauma is going to look like, because we haven't seen all of our kids in one place together. So comparatively to last year, prior to the pandemic, we had a lot of really great relationships with our students. And this year, those relationships are not as deep. They're not as strong. We don't really know what trauma they're experiencing besides what we're seeing on the surface.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Having the SIP program, we've seen trauma right before COVID, but we are definitely seeing different types of trauma with them. That it's baffling to me. So yeah, you're right. We haven't even begun to touch the surface of what's going to happen. So good point. Anybody else have something different or something they talked about that we haven't talked about yet?
I will say that my big surprise has been that secondary trauma, I think that's what we called it. I'm not as strong as I used to be, and I'm more easily affected by things. And that has come as a big surprise.
That's such a great point. Yolanda. I feel the same way. Like I've been doing this for 28 years. I've actually, was in the Pine School shooting, and I just think I'm tough as nails. And then this year comes and I'm like, I'm tired and I'm traumatized. And so that's a very good point. We're all exhausted. So the point is we're all involved in trauma, whether it's our own trauma, our secondary trauma, our kids in trauma. So what are we going to do? I guess that's the next point, right? What can we do? And we're going to talk about that further, but Brandy, I think you have a video for us. What does trauma look like in schools? If you would share the screen, can you do that? Or
I am, yes.
so
Yeah.
we have a little, while she's doing that, we have a little video for you. It's a good video. And then we'll talk about what it looks like in schools, what to do.
Okay, here we go.
Let's take a 5-year-old child who maybe comes into a classroom and they're putting their things in their cubbies, and maybe a child who has extensive history of lots of things happening, and maybe another kid like knocks over their bag. That 5-year-old child may shove that other little boy or girl down. They may yell. They may get really angry, and maybe a teacher comes over and says, "Rona, it's okay," and maybe reaches out to touch that little child, and the child pushes them away or goes under the table and really has this aggressive, what looks aggressive or explosive behavior. And what we know about trauma is maybe that child is really just trying, their life has been dysregulated, and that dysregulation is manifested in that moment. So you see really big responses to something really small. Maybe that same 5-year-old child has been in foster homes. And so maybe what we see is that with that trauma lens, that backpack is really significant to that child, because maybe it's one of the few things that that child owns or that belongs to them. And so belongings take on a different meaning for a child who didn't have a history of separation from a parent or things like that. So that's kind of these big behaviors that, and the child tends to lack the ability to communicate or verbalize, because those are the kind of skills that get impacted by adverse childhood experiences. So creating a narrative about what your experience is like, or being able to self-regulate. So there's a need for co-regulation in that moment. But a child's really, we talk a lot about, we see misapplied survival skills because a child's just surviving, but in the context of a school, we don't push our classmates, right? And we don't push at our teacher, and we don't throw things across the room, and we don't go under a table. But if that's what you've done to regulate, you're going to keep doing those things. So if a child doesn't have those skills and hasn't learned ways to rely on adults, then the adult's job is to help that child learn to co-regulate. And that might be, maybe I'm with that little 5-year-old Rona who is really upset. And in that moment, she's not going to be able to really process my language. And so what I might do is just use really soft voice, and I might say, "I'm right here with you. I'm going to keep you safe. I'm not going to let you hurt yourself or anyone else right now." And and it doesn't really matter what I'm saying, but I'm going to use quiet words. And I may say, "Let's breathe together." And I might have little 5-year-old who maybe now is crying and really having a hard time, because when little ones cry, they're kind of, and their breathing's really shallow, and that's going to make this little one more upset. And so I might just calmly have her breathe with me, or I might say, with the little ones, we often will use maybe a weight, like a sand toy, something that has a little weight, and we might say, "Do you want to hold this?" And just help that child co-regulate. If you're a parent, you can hold and do all those things, but we try to help that child learn that it's okay to calm down. But we have to guide them, because often they don't have the skills to do that. When we work with schools, we really try to help them shift from this lens of like, what is wrong with this kid, to what has happened to this child. I remember one time I was consulting with a team of teachers, and someone's like, and we talked about like, what is wrong with this kid? Someone was in that space, and their colleague said, "Oh, it'd be easier to say what's right with that kid because there's so many things." And a lot of the teens, for example, call, their teachers everything under the sun and say really awful things. And, for a teacher, you don't want to be told or called something really inappropriate. So there are certain things that are triggering to teachers that, and it's hard to move to that space of, so what's happening in this moment? Why is this kid yelling at me or cursing at me, or, whatever might be happening, or storming out of my classroom, to something's happened that is creating a response in this child. So that's the space that we try to shift to, and that what has happened to this child response would be more of, instead of assuming immediately like this is an aggressive response, or so many kids get suspended for defiant behavior. Now, what does that really mean? it can mean lots of different things, but instead of assuming that that behavior is defiance, it's recognizing in the moment, what just happened that maybe triggered this child? Like what occurred that, I just called on that child and maybe they're not prepared. Did I inadvertently shame that child? And then it's coming from a different place that you respond. And one of the best things I tell teachers is just take a moment. You know, when you're in that moment and you feel triggered and you feel escalated, stop. Don't respond immediately and just breathe through it. Because that's the place that if we respond from that anger or frustration, we're most likely to respond in a place of implicit bias or lack of understanding or all of those things. So it's slowing down that process. I mean, that's really the piece that, you know, the intersection that we see in being trauma-informed is that adult ability to regulate themselves. You really can't co-regulate a child if you're not regulated. And mindfulness, the ability to be present without judgment, you know, and not judgment on that child for whatever their behavior is, but just recognizing something happened in the classroom. There was a moment, and maybe a child is escalated, or you were hurt because of something they said, and just acknowledging that moment happened and not attaching a judgment to that, but acknowledging it, breathing, and then moving into a response.
That was powerful. I don't know if you guys really can resonate with it, but you know, over the years, I have definitely been one of those people to jump on a child for their misbehavior. But I really like the point in that video where she says, stop and breathe and ask myself what has happened with this child instead of what the heck's going on with Johnny today, right? Does anybody else have anything that resonated with them with that video? There was a lot of good stuff in it.
I liked how she said to take a breath and think about our reaction before we react, because we need to be mindful about the situation. I think sometimes we're fast to react, and we need to take that minute so that we do respond appropriately and not escalate the situation further or cause more trauma.
Well said, well said. And me being a former basketball player, that's what I like to do, is just respond real quick, because that's what I was supposed to do with basketball. But that doesn't really work when we're dealing with kids in trauma, or ourselves in trauma, or teachers in trauma. So yeah, take a moment. I keep trying to do my calm app every morning to try to calm myself down. Remember to breathe, Prem, remember to breathe. Anybody want to add anything else that they heard?
Wow, this is a really chatty bunch. I will say that it struck me is that if we can't manage our own emotions, we can't be teaching it to children. That's one thing that's always been important to me. I can't teach children these skills, emotion management, if I don't have it under control myself. Right. That one stuck out.
Well said, well said. Anybody else?
I just want to say that when she was describing an example of how trauma might look in a child with a backpack being tipped over, like she was literally describing something that I deal with every day whenever something happens in a classroom and a teacher needs help. And so it's so relevant. It's so exactly, you know, that is struggles that we as educators face and that kids are facing when they come to our classrooms. And I think that one particular child of ours that she was basically describing hadn't quite occurred to me yet that, oh, that child this is probably a reaction for something that I don't know anything about yet. So it's definitely important for us to think about, not just assume that a child is just, you know, struggling behaviorally and we need to put them on a point chart and this and that, but maybe there's more root to it that we need to try to get to. And that's that power of trying to create those relationships with the parents so that we're even privy to know, because they have to trust us to even allow us to know that there is trauma that they have in a home. Because if they don't trust you, you're not going to know.
Right, right. Well said, well said. So the whole point of this this breakout session here is we know we've got trauma. We know we've got to handle kids differently now. How do we do that? Even in a schools where people are being trained in trauma. We still miss the boat a little bit. So we got to get some systems in place. And I think that's the point of having you guys all here today is what can we put in place at our schools so that our adults in the building who are experiencing trauma too know how to handle when a kiddo is upset about a backpack, right? So I'm going to share the screen and kind of move on with our video here, our slide. Brandy, can you see that? Just making sure you can.
Yeah, I can. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself.
I know the feeling. There's a lot of times I need to mute myself when I usually the opposite direction. Okay, I need you to go away so I can hit play. Go away. Okay, well, it's not going to work, so I'm just going to do it this way. So we did our breakout session. I did some slides on all the things that we see trauma in school. We've already kind of touched on that. You touched on that in your breakout sessions and overall with all of us. And I saw these photos of these students and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have that kiddo in my classroom right now or my school. You know, you recognize these kiddos and that look. I've gotten that look quite a few times this school year. So what I want to point out here is we have to get away from the old ways of handling discipline. We can't add to the trauma. And when we overreact and we get our feelings hurt and we don't like to be talked to that way, we're adding to the trauma when we overreact to that. And there's no longer bad kid. Remember, we're like, oh my gosh, he's a bad kid. I don't know what's wrong with him. We got to stop thinking that way. And if you notice, that's why the chain is there. Like that's over. And how many times have you tried to get through to some child when they're really upset with you and you're trying to get through to them? That's not going to happen, right? It's not going to get through to a child and figure out what's going on when they're in the height of their escalation and they're so mad. So those are some things that are really important that I personally used to hang on to way back in the day that I've got to let go. And we've all got to let go of all of those types of old thinking and realize that there are so many students in our schools with trauma. So we have to ensure that these students have the skills needed to handle and use the appropriate emotions or reactions to situations. We have to teach them that. Where are we going to teach them that? Right? That's the next question. So we're going to teach them at lunch. We're going to make them come sit. Where are we going to teach that? So what I want to bring out is this. We've got to put some systems in place in our schools that we take the time to talk to the child and say, what has happened that you're so upset about? You need to be predictable. They need to have a sense of belonging and building relationships. For the longest time, when I started out at Pine as an assistant principal, I learned from Brad Boudreau about love and logic. And love and logic is all about building the relationship with a child. And that's the first step. So let's say a child gets in trouble. They're at my office, teacher's upset. The first thing I do is make sure and wait till they're calm before I find out what's going on. One of the old things that people used to do is you'd put kids on the wall or they'd be sent to the office to just sit there and steam and no one would talk to them. We can't do that anymore. So some of the things that we tried to do here at Diedrichson and my other schools is we'll go for walks. So I'll go for a walk and we'll walk around the school. If it's really cold, I'll walk inside the school so I can not freeze and talk and get to the bottom of what's going on with the kiddo. And if I haven't built a relationship with them, I spend more time talking to them about who they are. Sometimes I even tell them that they have to come back the next day and give me 10 things that are amazing about them. Those are the kinds of things that we have to do to get to the root of the problem of why you're pushing people on the playground and you're punching people on the playground. These kids need to know that they're good people. And then we need to take the time to teach them the skills. Hey, the next time somebody takes your backpack, take a breath, just breathe, use your words. So we're reteaching those skills, right? I like one of the bullets here says, write a behavior plan for adults when interacting with a student. I have never tried that, but I'm looking forward to that because we all have teachers and some of us are teachers and we're in and we don't know how to deal with that kiddo. So we make a behavior plan for the kiddo. But what we really need to do probably on top of that is probably make a behavior plan for us. I mean, especially if you're the one having that child in your classroom all year long, you might need a plan. How am I not going to lose it when Sally does what she does, right? So what a great idea.
It takes 100 repetitions for kids to build trust with someone. So you know those kids that are challenging to deal with, and you got to hang in there 100 times. And they're going to keep trying to push you away and, you know, do something to make you flip your lid. And it's like, we just have to kind of hang in there. So that's why having a behavior plan for what I have to do when I deal with that kid would be, like, I think really helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Brandy, for jumping in there. And you can see these other ones. These are different things that we try to do. I'm just going to keep moving on here. I thought I had another slide, but I guess I don't. That's all right. So what I do know is that I don't have all the answers, and I know there's some brilliant people in this school district. So what I'd like for you guys to do, and I'm seeing there's 83 participants. So what I'd like for us to do now is take some time on how do you handle students? What is your consequences? What, you know, how do we get away from punishing kids and actually finding out what happened to them and teach them the skills to be able to handle their emotions? What are you guys doing? I want to hear about that. I'd love to hear that. So we're going to go, you know, Jana, I talked about maybe going with the same group, but I think it'd be better if we mix it up. And I know I'm throwing you a curveball, and I told you I would do that, but why don't you send us to different groups? And
Okay.
would it be too much if I moved it to 5 instead of 3?
Per room, you want 5 per room?
Yeah, is that going to mess you up?
It won't mess me up. It's just going to take me a quick second.
No worries, no worries. I can talk while you're doing that. So talk about what your discipline looks like at your schools, and how are you thinking about the trauma? Are you going to plan to use the trauma-informed practices? What does it look like at your school to make it more trauma sensitive? And how will you, or how did you get your staff to buy into the trauma-informed practices that you've learned about or that you're trying? So as everybody's coming back in, I want to make sure that we make a good, strong point on some of the most important things that you can do at your schools. And it starts at the top and getting a system together. You know, I heard restorative justice. I've heard love and logic, you know, very powerful PBS component, the relationship building. We really have to be cognizant of the consequences that students have so that we're not triggering the trauma even more. We have to be, I was telling my group, I remember some teachers getting mad at me like, Prim, why are you being so nice to that kid? You know, he's a pain in my class. Why are you being so nice? And what I want people to understand is you don't have to be mean. We don't have to be mean to kids. We don't have to bring the hammer down. We've got to build relationships with them. And, you know, some of the teachers would say things like, well, they're just going to act up just so they can go see you because you're so nice to them. And it's actually, you know, that's not what happens. It doesn't happen that way. Now, if you're a mean teacher and you're not very nice to that kid, well, yeah, he's probably going to want to come to my office a lot more often, but maybe it's looking in the mirror too, and why aren't you building that relationship? And why, even when that child is making bad choices, why doesn't he want to stay in your classroom? What's going on there that he's even more traumatized, right? So we have a lot of work to do. I know that there are still people out there that don't buy into this. And so we have to start from the top down and bring it. And Kathy Gage in our group brought up a good point, is the more people do it and the more people see how well it works for them, the more the team's going to buy into it. And so we need as many role models as we can to really try to make sure that we're addressing trauma the way it needs to be addressed, and have consequences that are not going to trigger more trauma. But I've talked enough. We have a little bit of time. Brandy, what did you see in your breakout? What'd you hear?
We talked about, just especially for secondary kids, they just need like their space. They need like a minute to kind of get themselves together. Being willing to connect with those kids informally, making good connections with their teachers. It just goes back to that relationship. And then modeling with students how to regulate themselves. Many of our kids come to us and they don't know how to regulate their emotions. So to model that and help them through that is really important.
Modeling, for sure. Yes. Anybody else want to add into that?
Prima, I was thinking, just kind of thinking out loud with everyone, but I know they mentioned a lot that they really wanted to emphasize that this wouldn't take more time, and it's not something new we have to do or something to add on, that it's a very natural part of the day. And there's a little part of my heart that just wonders if we said, wait a second, that's not really the case. Initially, it really is going to take a lot more from you to do, particularly to become proficient at it. And that's okay. I was just talking in the little breakout session about how I feel this sense of urgency to teach and make sure all the curriculum's covered, but full well knowing in my heart that I can't cover the curriculum if there is something going on in the classroom that I need to address. And I think it's fair that as we start learning to do this and realizing that it will take time to do, that in the long run, then it won't take more time. Because hopefully those behaviors will start to become maybe not if extinguished, but more easily addressed, handled, we can move on. So I think if we're just really brutally honest, saying, you know, yes, I think that it will require more time and more of our learning expertise to do so. But in the long run, everyone wins. I don't know. But
that great point. It reminds me of the Love and Logic Bank, where you got to put some money in the bank. You got to put some, time into that child, and it's going to take a little bit extra, right? But it will pay off in the long run. And if you don't, your year's going to be hell. Sorry, it is. So, I mean, that's a very good point. I like that point. And, the curriculum is the curriculum, and I know that we've got to get to it, but we're not going to get to it if you've got kids in trauma and they're not going to listen anyway. So very good point. So those morning meetings, those are huge, right? We need to take time for those morning meetings. Even maybe the, closing meeting before you head home. Everybody okay? How was it today? What happened at recess? Let's, those kinds of things. So I'm hearing great things. Is there anybody else out there that wants to share what they came up with? All right, my wait time. How am I doing on my wait time, Molly? Did I do some good wait time?
I'll share. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, Molly, did you want to go? Are you sure?
I was just giving her some positive reinforcement on her wait time.
Dominique, nice to see you, hon.
Hi. Okay, so our group, we talked a lot. Well, I talked mostly in our group, but actually, I would say the dean at Dilworth also did. But I've been doing some work over the last 16 months with a coaching mentor with the NBA, and a lot of these NBA players have been doing some role modeling for students. And some of the things that I've taken away from their talks and our interactions have been There's, you know how, like you were saying, you want to fire back, right? We all want to just kind of go back, go back, go back. And he said, you know, you got to take a pause and think in your head, don't say it out loud, how fascinating. And you can, not to the kids, but just take a minute in your head and say how fascinating, but take those 2 words and take that break in your mind before you respond. And that can be for kids or for adults, but if you say it out loud, it's going to come across really sarcastic. So don't say it out loud, okay? So say it in your head, but you've got your pause of how fascinating, and then respond after you kind of had some time. They've also said that they're working on like the 3 A's, and it's accountability, align, and assure. So you're going to have accountability for the actions with you, the student, right? You and the student. You're going to talk about the accountability of whatever it is they may have done, said, that kind of thing. You're going to align yourself with them. I'm on your side. I'm here to help you. I want to be in your corner, you know, that kind of thing. And you're going to assure them that no matter what, you're there. You're going to be there every day. You're going to help them. You're going to have their back. What do you need? What do they need from you? How can you help them more? So you want to give them, you know, the accountability piece, because of course, whatever it is that they did, you want them to be responsible for their actions, because that's life. But then you want to align with them because you want to help them through whatever's going on and letting them know you're there. And then assure them that you will continue to be there and you are going to be that safe person for them. So those are some of the things that have come out of our talks with, like I said, that the coaching mentor and some of the NBA players we've talked with are just how fascinating for your pause and the accountability, align, and assure, so that those kiddos know you're there. And, you know, even middle school, high school, you know, those, just so that they know they're there, that you're there. You don't have to, obviously we can't hug, those kinds of things, but high five, air high five, foot, knuckles, whatever. But just letting them know that you're there and making sure that they know you're there every day, and no matter what they say was the big piece. And the other piece was you can't, you won't necessarily always see the kiddos that are going through trauma acting out. So there are the kiddos that are going through trauma and are hurting that you won't see. So just trying to keep an eye out for those kiddos also, that you're not going to actually see that. They might present in a different way, that you can also be there for them, because it might not present in, you know, outward actions, that there, you know, that there's something else you might be able to find that you can help them, because they will be the inward person that's hurting and that has experienced a traumatic event.
Well said, Dominique. Thank you. That is good. That I really like what you just said. Where there's some kids we just won't even know that they're in the middle of trauma. Brandy, we have a video. I think it's I don't know how long it is, but I think we're getting close to time. So I'd like to finish with that. What do you think, Brandy?
That sounds great. Yep. I will start sharing this again.
I appreciate all of you guys' participation and joining us. I certainly prefer more interactive presentations.
Hang on, I'm sorry.
You got me on pure edge right now, Brandy.
No, that's not
That was
what
a joke.
Now I'm stuck. I'm trapped and I can't get out. Oh, found it.
You're in Zoom. You're in a Zoom trap?
I'm in a Zoom trap. Let's see if this works. Here we go.
When we use the word trauma, many people feel that we're talking about just a small percentage of kids. But the fact is, trauma is much more ubiquitous than any of us know, and certainly we have been in many schools and high poverty communities where the children exposed to trauma is greater than 50%. I began by working as a child psychiatrist with kids who had known trauma. They came to my office often complaining about the same things. Certainly trouble in school, distractibility, impulsivity, sometimes aggressivity, and a lot of trouble trusting and having good relationships with kids or with adults. Adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. Children under stress will have release of the hormone cortisol, and cortisol has effects on the learning center of the brain, which is the limbic system. At the same time, if children have a buffering relationship and the release of the hormone oxytocin, This will oppose many of the negative effects of cortisol and result in some of the resilience that we see and a normalization of brain architecture. If we're going to design schools that develop a learner who can learn anything, then that school needs to be designed for children who will come to school at different starting points. Stress and trauma cause uneven development of certain kinds of critical skills and mindsets that kids need for learning. So if we design those into a school environment so that things like self-regulation and executive function and growth mindset are things that we can actually build, then in effect we've created schools that'll have the physical and emotional safety, the sense of belonging, the relationships, and the intentional development of the skills and mindsets associated with learning. The story in developmental science is an optimistic one, and it rests on the fundamental property of the brain that is its malleability. Negative things in children's lives can certainly do harm, but positive things can restore children to a healthy developmental path. More importantly, if we provide integrated developmental experiences for children in schools, we will not only enable them to recover from the effects of trauma, we will unleash the potential that exists in every single child.
Okay, that was great. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it. I appreciate the kind words, Brandy. Thank you for co-hosting this with me, and I hope it's been helpful for all of you. So thank you.